been a sort of not so surprising or maybe an unofficial source of inspiration for most of industry, certainly tech industry, for a long time. In fact, there's probably never been a genre that's been a bigger inspirer of innovation than science fiction. A better term to use in science fiction is probably speculative fiction, because it opens itself up for other types of fictions that we don't normally view necessarily in our consumer lives, including things like in the 1950s, these were very popular called industrial films that companies made to talk about the future of their products. Were these little fictional worlds of the future. They were actually very interesting. My co-author Chris Nossel and I have spent the last 10 years investigating, documenting, and analyzing science fiction in mostly television and films, but also in industrial films and things like that, in order to learn lessons that we can apply for innovation. And in addition to specific lessons that might apply necessarily to the interaction design world, we've also found hundreds of lessons that, which I'll share a few of. But we've also found that science fiction as a technique, as a process, can be a mechanism for industry to use as an innovation process in order to deliberately use science fiction towards innovation. One of our favorite examples of this is this film, comes from this film X-Men, and there was a gentleman, an engineer from the Department of Defense in the US and the Pentagon, worked in the Army Corps of Engineers, and his job, well, I'll get to that in a second. He goes to this movie with his son. He didn't really want to see the movie, but his son wanted to see it. And here at the end of the film, he sees something incredible to him, because this sort of table, this map table, it's a little annoying to all of us. This little map table is something that he and his colleagues are responsible for in his job at the DoD. In fact, they create something that are still called, surprisingly, sand tables for military use in planning battlefields, etc. So he sees this scene in the movie. He is absolutely astounded that they found sort of a better solution than anything that they've been working on. He goes back to the DoD, writes a new RFP, a request for proposal, inserts a reference to this film. So military contractors are asked to watch this film in order to see the kind of thing that he wants to build, and of course they go and build it. And this is sort of the third version of this. This is in use now, or probably some later incarnation of it. And they use it, they actually did one better where they have projection on top so that they can change scales on a moment's notice. They not only use it for battlefield planning, but also for exploration, for instance, where the next Mars rover should go. The point of this is that this thing exists because some guy saw something in science fiction, in a film. And that's pretty incredible. So science fiction and the real world are in this reciprocal relationship of influencing each other and inspiring each other. And not only does it work where developers, engineers, other kinds of designers see things in science fiction and then go build things, but it works in the reverse as well. We see that art directors and production designers and directors and writers see things in the real world, and it inspires them to build things in science fiction. Anyone ever see this film? It's fantastic. The problem with this is it's not very formal. It's incredibly undeliberate, and therefore as a mechanism for us to use this innovation, it's not reliable. But it's time to now make these processes and this sort of documentation that we found of a process for innovation more formal so that we can use it more deliberately. And all the best examples we have are of things that developers and engineers and designers saw in science fiction and then moved to create in the real world, or at least lessons that they learned from science fiction that they've brought into the real world. Now, Gartner Group in 2000 developed this idea of a hype cycle, which sort of discusses the path and the time it takes a technology to move from initial idea to successful innovation or a successful implementation in the market. It's about 30 years. And 30 years is a really interesting moment because it was 30 years to the year from Star Trek's communicator to the StarTAC, get it? StarTAC. flip phone. It was the first successful commercial flip phone, small mobile phone. And what's interesting about this story is that the StarTAC is intentional. While they were developing this product, the engineers constantly referenced the communicator from Star Trek. And one of the reasons why is that the previous product, which was not terribly successful, the MicroTAC, when the engineers were developing this, they were all excited about it. So they brought it over to the Argonne National Laboratories, which is near Motorola's mobile phone division in Illinois, and they showed it to their friends, the scientists over at Argonne National Laboratories, and the first thing that the scientists said was, oh, you built it backwards. Nobody had ever built one of these before. So the engineers said, what do you mean, what are you talking about? What do you mean we built it backwards? And they said, like on Star Trek. And if you look at these two things, they're pretty similar. The only difference is where the keypad is. Is it on the top or is it on the bottom? But it was enough to help influence the success of the product in the market. And part of the reason for that is that people had been watching these reruns for almost 30 years. And so not only are engineers and developers influenced by this, but so are audiences and customers. And we can think of this as sort of 30 years worth of user testing, or at least user training, to say what is the correct form factor and solution for mobile communications. And it turns out this wasn't it, this was it. We find other examples that we can apply to industry, like volumetric projection in communication in Star Wars is always based on scale. So hierarchy within an organization is reflected through scale. Why is the Emperor so big compared to Darth Vader? Well, he's the head of the organization, so he's projected much bigger. But on the Jedi Council, everyone is equal because they're an egalitarian group. So they're all projected, no matter where they're coming in from, at the same scale. So scale is signaling hierarchy in a really important way. And science fiction gets this. We don't always get this in our own product development. So this is a lesson that we can bring into our own design of solutions, is that the things that we design, if they don't reflect scale correctly, like they do in Star Wars and other sources, they will likely fail because they fail the social contract, they fail the social context for what's happening in the situation. Here's an example where a 5,000-year-old weapon, or actually defense against a weapon, has to be assembled, and of course none of these people lived 5,000 years ago, and the languages are all different. So the instructions for the product, for the assembly of the defense, has to be built into the physicality, the physical part of the product itself. That's an interesting challenge in science fiction, but what does it have to do with today? Well, it's exactly the same challenge that the engineers, the architects, and the developers over at Onkalo, which is the only long-term nuclear waste storage facility being built in Finland. It's the exact same problem or challenge that they're faced with today. How do we communicate what's going on here, and especially to stay away, for 100,000 years, not even 5,000 years, when we don't know what languages people will speak? The opposite of this is a little humorous short from Pixar, in Lifted, where we have a first-time alien out on his first task to go abduct a human, and he reminds us what it's like to learn a complex system when it isn't intuitive. In fact, we don't see a lot of interface jokes in science fiction, which is unfortunate. We see a lot of anthropomorphization over and over again in science fiction, and we see it over and over again in industry as well. It's a popular trope, it's a popular goal of both systems. Unfortunately, and by the way, anthropomorphization is basically just rendering a system with human-like characteristics. The problem is it's really difficult to do. Now, we as humans are more abundantly weird. We really like anthropomorphization. We anthropomorphize everything. We talk to our cars, we name our Roombas. It's something that comes very natural to us because it's a very social interaction with a complex system.
Don't touch Turbo Boost. Something tells me you shouldn't touch Turbo Boost.
And it's so powerful that we don't even need a human likeness to trigger this effect for us, right? Here, just voice is enough to do the anthropomorphization. In fact, not even voice is necessary. In Star Wars, the most popular, most endearing character, sorry, that's a little loud, is R2-D2 probably, arguably the best acted character in Star Wars. R2-D2 accomplished this sort of endearment without even having a voice. All it has is beeps and buzzes. So we are natural anthropomorphizers, which is great. But anthropomorphization is really difficult to pull off.
Prompts for change. You have changed, Sam.
And the combination of image and voice here for Gertie, the robot in his example, is a really good compromise for complex systems that really can't act too socially acceptable or aren't truly artificial intelligence. Now, Microsoft, no company other than Microsoft has done more experiments in actual product shipping around anthropomorphization, but we all know that these haven't been entirely successful. In fact, they've been some pretty spectacular failures. In this case, I don't know if you've ever seen Ms. Dewey, but she's going to go off here in a minute, reacting to something that, she's a video search engine. She's an interface to a video search engine. Why Microsoft, with their experience and how difficult this is, would create this.
No, go to Ghetto Fabulous motherfucking step to this piece of just because you picked
Stop, okay.
Robert Jordan.
This is hard to do. Now contrast this with Knowledge Navigator, another industrial film that came out from Apple in 1987. Here we have the system also rendered as a sort of person, but specifically and purposefully low res. And the reason for this is that the lower resolution of the rendering of the system telegraphs to users that it's not a real person. Don't have the same expectations of this system that you would of a person. You can ask Phil to do a lot of things, but he's not always going to get it right. He's certainly not as good as a human system. But the moment that we raise the resolution up to photorealism or human realism, our expectations get way out of bounds with the actual capabilities of the system itself. And there's something called an uncanny valley where if we raise the resolution of humanness too high, it just gets creepy. And that's because both on the visual side and the behavioral side, if it looks real but can't function real, it's essentially a dead person. It's creepy to us. And this is a very basic instinct. So if you see these sort of artificial humans that get developed in labs, they look creepy to us because they're essentially mimicking a dead person because they can't quite mimic a live person well enough. This is the trap that you need to avoid with this kind of anthropomorphization. I love Bounty Bear. So Bounty Bear is a really interesting solution to this. Rather than humanizing the system, it's zoomorphizing the system. And this is a really good approach for tech producers and tech developers to render their system more as a pet than a person. Because our expectations of Bounty Bear aren't as high as they would be with a real person. And a pet is actually a better approximation of the system's capabilities than would a human be. But behavior is all that's really necessary. It doesn't have to look like a bear, it doesn't have to look like a human. Here we have an example of a completely non-anthropomorphized object, this robot carrying a fire extinguisher, acting and emoting from us behaviors that we associate as humans. So behavior is really the key to all of this if you want to play this game. Now, science fiction has had a huge effect in setting our expectations of what we should be working on in the first place. We constantly make these androids and flying cars and other things because science fiction has told us that's what the future was supposed to be, whether or not they're viable, whether they're not good ideas in the first place. The best futures are human ones, and the ones that reflect human needs and values. I don't know who lives here, but it's not a human. There's no curios, there's no family portraits, there's no throw pillows even. There's nothing here that's human. There's just a set. And unfortunately, that's what most of our futures look like when we do futuristic explorations and we make products for the future. They're not human futures. That's something that we have to change if we care about this. Science fiction is a great way to prototype new technologies, technologies that don't yet exist and possibly technologies that can't even exist. That's fantastic. Think of this as science fiction thinking as an analog to design thinking. So what we've run are lots of science fiction workshops, prototyping workshops, where we help people get past and out of the boundaries that they normally do, especially in their corporate settings, in order to discover new ideas and push their products and their innovation further. So we have them choose a character in a domain, and then we have them work out what the product would be like for that character in this domain. We had a really good example of an engineer that worked for UPS working on their internal shipping systems, and he was a big fan of the Aliens movies, and so he chose first the Alien Queen. We said, well, the Alien Queen doesn't really use technology, she's probably not a good character to use as a user. Why not use Ripley, though? Because she's actually in shipping. If you remember this film, the second episode, she ships products. So why don't you design the product that Ripley would use in the Alien universe? And that was fantastic. So when we had them brought it back, we had them push with, we always have people push with technologies that they're not using, but then we have them bring it back to the present. And what happens is they have breakthroughs that they've never had before because they had the opportunity to be inspired by things that they've never been able to integrate before. They push faster. And then at the very end, what we do is we ask them to give it a sort of sci-fi patina. And the easiest way to make something look sci-fi, by the way, is you make it blue and you make it glow. Kid you not. Now, one of the reasons for doing this is to dress it up and make it look nice. Really, one of the reasons to do this is to wow people like investors and managers, because the moment people see it with this sci-fi patina, regardless of what's underneath, they automatically think it's more futuristic. So it's a little game that you can play when you want to innovate a little bit further than you normally can. This is the process. You certainly can follow it yourself. There's lots of companies that are already doing this. We've run these workshops, and other people have run these workshops. Governments have run these. This is a successful, serious prototyping and development method that you should be using as well, and I'll quickly explain why it works. Most of design, it turns out, is fiction already. Most of the stuff that designers create are just fictions. All our prototypes are fictions. They don't become fact until they hit the market, when they affect other people's lives. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between the things that we look at in sci-fi and how it's created, and the things that we look at in design and how it's created. And going one further, there's also a one-to-one correspondence with business, because it turns out that most of business is fiction already too. Now, we don't like to remind our coworkers and our investors and our employees, and certainly not our customers, that we're in the fiction business, but anything with a plan, marketing plan, strategy plan, financial plan, hasn't happened yet. It's fiction. It's just like this. And that's why science fiction prototyping can be successfully used for business, for serious business purposes. Same thing with policy. Science fiction will probably be an important part of prototyping new policies to deal with new technologies. Now, in closing, I just want to say that the sophistication of our audiences is growing rapidly, and we as developers need to respond to it. This is what they're used to seeing. And this looks nothing like what the devices, the interfaces we find in our devices today. And that's going to become a challenge because our audiences are rapidly growing more sophisticated than our products. And in fact, in some cases, it's almost indistinguishable between what they see in science fiction and what they're already using today in their products. So in closing, I just want to say that William Gibson once had a famous quote that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I would just like to say that, in other words, our futures are things that we're creating already. They're already fact. The things that we're working on in our labs and in our studios, they're just not facts for everyone yet, everywhere. Lastly, there's an old adage that says that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. But I would say also that those that forget the future are also doomed to repeat it. Thank you very much.